Welcome to the Developers Who Test podcast, a podcast for developers who embrace test automation so they can ship better quality software faster and have more fun doing it. I'm your host, Chris Harbert, and I'm here today with Evan Niedojadlo. Evan is the engineering manager and product operations at Peddle, a company that streamlines the car selling process by getting you an offer in minutes, free pickup, I hear sometimes as early as same day, and payment on the spot. Welcome to the Developers Who Test podcast.
Hey, everybody.
Today's episode of the Developers Who Test podcast is brought to you by Testery.com. Whether you're a developer who has just a handful of tests or even thousands, then your tests deserve to be running on the fastest and most reliable platform for open source testing. With AI-driven insights and analytics, unparalleled parallelism, and awesome integrations, Testery enables you to get more from your tests. Check us out today at Testery.com. So it looks like you've been working at Peddle for a while and have had some interesting role changes during your time there, and specifically made the leap from test engineering to site reliability engineering, and then were recently promoted to being an engineering manager. I'd love to start out with a few questions about what that journey was like for you.
Yeah, absolutely.
So site reliability engineering, you hear a few different definitions. So what does it mean to you, and how does it overlap with test engineering?
Sure. I mean, the easy answer is just keeping things running. In all honesty, keeping the lights on. That's the easy answer. There's so much more complexity to that. In the depths of everything you can go down, avoiding burnout with your team, and who has the pager, the metaphorical pager. There's a lot that goes into it, but I would just say for us, in the context of Peddle, was essentially keeping the lights on, keeping things going, keeping things moving, building processes around alerting, that whole space, avoiding alert fatigue, which is, that kind of the burnout piece where, you have too many alerts, establishing service level objectives, defining SLIs, service level indicators. There's a lot to it where, you can read, which I've read, the Google site reliability engineering book. It's a massive book, some of which I've just used on Audible. I was listening to it on Audible to get the bits and pieces that I needed. But the goal of that was not taking everything from, an enterprise company. We're a much smaller organization. So I was taking the bits and pieces that worked for us to build out the process from the ground up.
Yeah, I love that you say that. I see a lot of folks out there where they'll just see, oh, this is how Google does it. This is how Microsoft does it. And then they immediately assume, well, that's the right way to do it. And I love that you bring up that, because your organization was smaller, there are some differences that are important. The classic example I see there is like, can you do A/B testing and automatic rollbacks of your code? Well, if you're a Google and you have, 1,000 people performing the same operation every second, and you send 5% of them down a new path, you'll find out pretty quickly if it doesn't work. If you're a B2B startup and the CFO is running the report once a year, then, you're not going to get that feedback into your A/B system right away. And that bug could sit out there for months or even a year before it gets discovered. So I love Absolutely. That you bring that up. What were some of the differences between big company and small company when it comes to site reliability engineering?
I think one of the biggest problems that we had is during the day, we didn't have enough people. All right, so here's a pretty decent one. We have we work with teams in different time zones, and of course our team, the main thing isn't as large as Google or Meta, whoever. But what we ended up doing was we couldn't have like a pager, like a on-call person that just takes a shift, right? Like that's something like during the day. Like if I was working during the day, I couldn't take the pager. Like there wasn't enough people to do it on a daily basis. So I ended up doing was doing like a follow the sun rotation. So like that was something that kind of helped us out where during my nighttime I didn't have to be called. So that really helped us quite a bit. Another team picked it up. So that's something I don't know if other teams are doing that at a larger scale. but that's definitely something that we wanted to focus on just because we didn't have enough people. We wanted to follow a similar process of like on call and everything. But it just had to be during certain times of the day and everything else. So that's something that we did as well. I think, interesting, like reading into those books and, like reading the blogs, and there's just so many different good sources of information out there on this now. One of the things that I did as well was like, really determining like, did we need Kubernetes or not? That's something like the certain technologies that were mentioned in the book, like Borg at the time, like, pre Kubernetes and everything else, like that's, the massive scale that they're doing and that they're allowing for, was something like, are we actually going to scale that far? Like, do we need to roll out pure, Kubernetes on, we tried it a couple times. We tried GKE, and then we tried EKS, which we ended up settling for EKS. But like, even when in hindsight, like looking back on it, and where we're at in terms of scale, like, did we even need to do that? Should we have done, use like Fargate or something like that, and run things a little more, hands off? Like, that's definitely, a lot of things. There's so much hype in the industry at that time. This was like 2018, 2019, when we were starting to work on this stuff and build out some of those processes and the infrastructure and the processes around those infrastructure. The community as well around here. I'm based out of Austin, Texas area. And I used to go to a lot of meetups in Austin, and there's such hype around that space and the Kubernetes space and, everything else. So yeah, I mean, it was infectious, and a lot of us, and ended up taking things that we could and taking things that we couldn't, from all those conversations and the books that were published and everything else. So
Cool.
yeah, those are just some of the ideas.
Yeah. So one of the things I noticed about your journey was you were actually the first SRE person. So, whose idea was it to form an SRE team, and
Sure.
how did your company know it was the right time to do it?
So we at the time we started a new project, and this was probably 2018. We started this new project. We like our existing workloads that were making the business money were on EC2, some of which still are. Like some of those workloads are still on EC2, which is fine. It's making the business money. And so we decided there's as like a stealth project that we were working on, and the idea was more it was more workflow generation driven. Like we were trying to do a lot of stuff with in the workflow space. And basically where the goal behind it at a high level was to have the business owners be able to work on their own processes, basically draw it out, like, so quite literally draw it out. And then you could deploy a microservice based off of that drawing. Like that was a very, very, very interesting project we were working on, but like it ended up not working out, which is another story to talk about. But basically at that time we needed, we had a very, very small project we were working on. We had, we had the developers, we had, kind of like the management at the time, the vision, I should say, part of that team. And then, what they were missing was infrastructure. And that's where I came into play. My previous background was in test automation, test checking, whatever you want to call it. Like that's something that I was in. And some of my background was infrastructure, a little bit of us, but then I was kind of thrown into the mix and like, hey, you're going to do infrastructure now. So not only did I have to learn, the best approaches and from the community at large, but also how can we maintain the uptime of the infrastructure that we're deploying. And I will say, like, Google Cloud, like at the time we decided on Google Cloud, and one of the things that we were looking at was Google Kubernetes Engine. And at the time, Google Kubernetes Engine had this concept of SLOs like embedded in it. Like it wasn't even a matter of like, something standalone or something, something you bake into it, but it was like part of Google Cloud. So like, of course, Google being, the kind of the origination of like SRE and everything else. But so it was interesting because that it was kind of like, it was a combination of the community, the tooling that was chosen, and kind of like how we needed, like we just knew that we needed to kind of maintain this uptime of this infrastructure in this project. So I guess it was a combined combination of things. Like it was kind of the goals that we needed to do. But yeah, that's kind of the background there. I guess that's the best way to mention it. It was a combination of technologies and community and learning that, we not only did I need to run this infrastructure, but I also needed to maintain it. And like, as if
Mhm.
like kind of like a startup project, it was something I had to do by myself at the time, which, as you can
Yeah.
imagine, wasn't ideal. But like, the more I learned about it, so it was kind of like, yeah, thrown into it, mix of scenarios, but it worked
Yeah.
out in some
I
ways.
I love how there seems to be a natural overlap between doing test engineering the right way and learning a lot about infrastructure. So that was kind of what got me on my journey. You know, building Testry where we scale automated tests. We've run over 100 million tests on our platform. You don't get there without learning something about infrastructure. And so that was really how I got started with learning about things like Dockerization and scaling things up and everything. And it led to some interesting situations where we had to test the infrastructure to make sure the infrastructure was working correctly and scaling up properly. And you mentioned, when we were chatting before the episode started, that you've got some experience. So I'd love to hear, how do you test infrastructure, and how is testing infrastructure different than testing applications or websites?
Sure. Yeah, for us, a lot of it was primarily alerting. So we would wrap alerting around our infrastructure. That was a big piece of it. The testing piece itself, I would say, like from a performance standpoint, like we'd use JMeter at the time. Like now it's a little bit of K6 and JMeter, but like that was kind of a big component of it. Like we would testing out, I guess, say like building the infrastructure itself and testing it was primarily like exploratory in a lot of ways. Like we would deploy a Kubernetes cluster, deploy a couple pods, monitor the CPU, monitor the memory and everything else. Like that was a big piece of it. And then just really ensure right sizing. That was like a big piece of it as well. So like potentially we would what we'd do is deploy a bunch of pods, maybe like deploy BusyBox, kind of ramp it up and kind of get an understanding of like, is this infrastructure that we're going to pay for? Does this make sense? Or is this right size to the point where we're not going to see like, this running at like 11% CPU over the next couple of months, and we're being charged for something that doesn't make much sense. We have maybe some node sizes that are like too large. So that's kind of like a lot of it was exploratory testing in combination with alerting.
Mhm.
I would say like that's kind of the main things, and some tooling in there as well. Like I said, BusyBox we would use, and JMeter, K6. Like those are some tools I would use there. Um, yeah, I mean that's just the mostly performance related and costs. That was like a big piece of it. We didn't want to deploy something that we are essentially not paying for. We wanted the elasticity out of Kubernetes. It was a big deal for us.
Cool. Yeah, yeah, we were doing, when I first got into spinning up infrastructure for testing, we were going for that whole, infrastructure as code principle, where you have configuration files that spin up infrastructure.
Yep.
And, at the time we were using something like, I think we were using what was called Salt Stack. And so Salt
Yep.
is
So it's
all like YAML file based. And, we kept running into these situations where we would be spinning up, 10 different types of servers in some kind of configuration. And one of them would get to step 6 or 7 of the process, and it would fail because the configuration wasn't even a valid YAML file, right?
Oh
And
yeah.
so, me coming from a testing background, I said, well, there's got to be a way that we can test this. And so we just wrote unit tests to run around our configuration scripts to just make sure all of the YAML files are valid before we even kick off any of the deployment process, right? So I,
Cool.
I think there
Yeah.
are a lot of like interesting ways that we as testers can apply our skills to the infrastructure world, whether it's on the performance side, alerting, checking to see if things got deployed correctly. Why not write a unit test to see, you know, do all of the boxes in our infrastructure have a certain security patch, or have they all been updated to a specific version of things? There are a lot of opportunities where the testing framework, I think, does a lot of the heavy lifting for you, so you don't have to reinvent everything.
Absolutely. And it's funny you mentioned Salt. That's something when I was starting to get into things. There's at the time, it was I think it was like the big ones were Chef, Puppet, Ansible.
Hmm.
I think it
Yeah.
was before that, of course, CF Engine. But definitely, like I think the interesting thing about particularly Chef, I want to focus on like not that we were using it, but I just the interesting thing about like when I was working with Rails, for example, was just how in depth the testing of Rails was. Like you had Capybara, you had like a whole bunch of different aspects of it, and then you could take some of those concepts from Rails and that testing ecosystem and apply them to Chef, and to your cookbooks and everything else. So I thought that was always super interesting. But yeah, that led to, I mean, me reading about all of that back in the day was like interesting, which led to exactly what you mentioned, that Terraform, like testing out our modules. For us, we have linting, we use Terraform Cloud. So we have kind of debating on drift detection. That's something we need to check out and look into. But there's definitely some aspects of, yeah, I mean, the testing background helped out quite a bit there, just with our infrastructure as well,
Cool.
with especially with Terraform. But yeah, that's awesome.
So if you're a tester who likes to develop, would you recommend looking into the SRE route? Like who's it for and who's it not for?
Um, I think so, because there's definitely like at least in the infrastructure space, there's so much. I mean, now it's like the term. There's a whole separate, probably an entirely different talk to do on the titles and everything else, and like recruiter driven titles and whatnot. But at least with SRE and how we were doing it in our context, since we were doing the infrastructure as well, and kind of like building it and running it and maintaining it. I think there's like some AWS or Amazon approach to do it. You build it, you run it, but that's funny. But yeah, I mean, I would say it's a pretty good role to get into, because you're using your testing background to understand how you deploy the infrastructure. So like if you're hopefully maintaining all of your infrastructure in some kind of infrastructure as code approach, regardless of that's AWS's approach, Terraform, however you want to do it. Google Clouds, I know they have their own their proprietary software around this. Pulumi, like there's a whole bunch of options now, but at least with Terraform, there's really, I mean, even more recently, they just launched kind of like a dedicated, kind of testing framework around it. So like, yeah, I mean, it's a good thing to get into without a doubt. It's a good pivot. Um, Even more so nowadays, like I even see some testers, like some people that I've talked to in the past, that kind of do infrastructure as well. Like if they're, depending on the size of the company, if they're like a super small company, and then they can use like LLMs to like augment their knowledge on that as well. But yeah, I mean, in general, at a high level, yeah, totally. I think it's a good pivot in terms of career, to switch over. Um, and then just the downside of that is, of course, the on-call process. That's something to work out. It might be something new, because, when a test failed, even now, like I'm, looking at our Slack over there, but like when a test fails, we don't have a process where somebody's paged for that. Like that's just not something we do at the moment. There are failures, you address it the next day kind of scenario, or like whatever day you're waking up on. So if a test fails that night, you wake up, you address the test, that kind of thing. But like I haven't really seen that process where like a test is connected to something like OpsGenie or PagerDuty. Something I haven't seen, but just a heads up for anyone who wants to get into the reliability engineering space. There are scenarios where you might run into, you're given a pager and you have to get on call with different hours. It just depends on the process, whether or not they're doing follow-this rotation or something. So it's just
Yeah,
warning.
we actually added that integration for OpsGenie to our testing platform, so I can attest to
Oh,
that there are companies that do it.
very
Um,
cool. Okay.
where I normally see that is if you're running a subset of your tests to monitor production.
Yeah.
Then in those cases, people want to get paid sometimes if
Right.
your purchase path test fails in production,
Yeah.
that
And that's
becomes
that's something we
something you respond to. So,
Oh, got it. Yeah, and that's something we
mm,
just started doing. So just for transparency as well, like we just started doing actual automated production tests.
mm,
So that's fairly new to us. Like it was risky because there's the whole data thing that we had to worry about and everything else. Like we didn't, we do a lot of tracking and of our data and A/B tests and everything else. But like, yeah, that's super interesting. It might give me some ideas around
mm.
that. If you build
Cool,
something around that, that's cool.
cool. Yeah, so you mentioned making pivots. There's pivots in roles, of course, but there's also, one of the types of pivots a lot of companies go through is changing from one testing framework to another. And like me, you've been around a while, so I've seen that you did, a conversion from, I think you went from Ruby to Python, and then another one from Python to, it sounds like maybe Playwright or Cypress, Python to Cypress, and now Python to Playwright. So anyway, I'm really curious, at what point do you know it's time to go to a new framework, and kind of, how do you go about picking that new framework when it's time to go to a new framework?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I guess it's interesting because this particular organization I've been at for so long now, and when we, I guess I'll start from the beginning. And when we were looking at adding automation to so our process was, for a while it was quite literally just manual testing, exploratory testing, whatever you want to call it. There's so many different terminologies in the industry, but like we would quite literally, something would hit staging, like dev, we had some unit tests. We didn't have a lot of unit tests. Like that was, a topic for another day. But that's, we something got to staging, and we would go through, and I would kind of share the role between like, I was like a tester, but I was also in like product, and more specifically like release engineering. So it was a small team. So of course, you're kind of doing a lot of things. It's just what it is. So we'd go through, we'd have some, quite literally test cases that we would have. And at the time we were using, I believe, Zephyr. So we looked at TestRail, we looked at GoRec TestRail. We were using Zephyr. We still use Zephyr to some degree, at least with like exploratory testing and time boxing. But yeah, I mean, we got to a point, especially like moving to Austin, because I was from the East Coast. The company moved down. I moved down with the company, and the community in Austin was unbelievable. I mean, I got to speak to it briefly, but I ended up meeting a lot of really cool people in the space. Met a lot of good friends. Ended up, spending some time at other companies, understanding what they did, just, basically just hanging out there. In all honesty, like particularly at the time it was called HomeAway, and then they became Verbo, and a whole other, so that was that company. And there are a lot of really, I mean, I think there are people there who like wrote books. I'm not going to drop names, but like there's just some deep knowledge of the space. These are some people that have been in the industry forever. And it was interesting because, the more I learned about how organizations were doing things, the more that I wanted to take it to our company, which ended up working out. And one of those things was without a doubt, like automating, your tests, your checks. That was a big deal because just the speed of the process, made sense to me. And then a company, Sauce Labs at the time, they did they're still Sauce Labs, but they did a big talk in like, I think it was like 2011, 2012 in Austin. And they did at a company called Whale Shark Media downtown. I think they're called Retail Me Not now. But it was really cool because that opened my eyes up to understand, the power of, the speed, how quickly we could release versus doing all of these, these manual checks that we were doing, with Zephyr. And, from there, I looked at either Ruby or Python. And that was something that was of interest. So I spent the time, worked with Ruby, built out some Rails applications, showed some, I guess at the time we were calling them MVPs internally, of what tools we could use. We didn't end up on Ruby, but I was very, very impressed by just the Rails ecosystem in general with how they were handling testing, how many options there were in testing. A huge focus in Rails was on testing, which I always found interesting. But we ended up with Python, which is fine. We ended up with PyTest and Selenium specifically. So we did Python, PyTest, Selenium. What helped me out there and what helped the team understand things was a book, a couple books, one of which was How Google Tests Software. And then, going back to HomeAway, they were giving out those books to their employees there. And I ended up getting one through my friend who worked there. And it is understanding of, this is the way the industry is going. So it was not only a shift of like, we need to do this quickly, just to be able to release more quickly. And but it was also a matter of like, oh, the industry is moving this way. So it's like, oh, well, I guess I have to do this too. But we chose Python, Selenium, PyTest. It worked really, really, really well. In fact, it worked so well that some of our legacy test suite is still there. Like, it's still working really well. So just the issue of that, we got up to a point of switching frameworks for, switching test suites fairly recently. I mean, the conversation kind of started maybe 2018, 2019, when that initial, like that stealth project took off and we were working on that project. And really the conversation around that became more of team management. And it was a matter of, it was not switching for the sake of the new shiny tool or anything like that. It wasn't that. It was more so around how can we allow the rest of our team to take on some of this work? Do we really need a
Mhm.
dedicated test team? We looked at the Microsoft model and everything else. Like there's a whole bunch of things going on back then, uh, which changed and kind of changed back, which is kind of funny. Like if you dig deep into it, but we wanted more team members to be able to take on these tests. We wanted the front end team to be able to contribute to tests as well. So as a result, we looked at Cypress. Eventually, Playwright was talked about. We looked into Playwright. We did some more MVPs, some proof of concepts around that, mostly proof of concepts, and then we took that further, built out an MVP, and then we basically uh, went with Playwright for the reasoning of. I mean, there are a lot of reasons really. I could break down all of
Mhm.
these, but it was the speed. It was just how these tests were written. Um, like with the support of TypeScript was a big deal to us because we wanted to, me specifically, I wanted to match the front end language that we're using at the company. That was a
Yeah,
big
I
deal. Yeah,
yeah, I think that's a really good point. A lot of people they do get into that chase the shiny new framework mentality,
yeah,
and it's a lot of work to undergo transitioning a framework. So you have to have a good reason to do it, and I think a better reason than just blaming your framework for being flaky, which you know s-
yeah,
we've talked about it before on the podcast. It's a bit of a myth that Selenium is flaky. If the
right,
tests are written well and you're managing the infrastructure properly, then you can
yep,
absolutely get fast, reliable test runs. Um,
one
but
hundred
that
percent.
idea
Yeah,
that you want to enable the rest of the team to participate in testing, I think that's huge because if you're asking a developer who's spending their entire day in Visual Studio Code or IntelliJ, and they've got their IDE set up for TypeScript, and they really like how everything's set up, and they can compile and they can deploy, and they're familiar with all the tools. And then you say, "Oh, now I want you to install a different IDE or configure it differently to spin up this entire stack." That's a big source of context
yep,
switching. There might be a learning curve when you bounce between these languages. Or even worse, I see some people who go the route of they're like, oh, now we should do, codeless test automation. We're not going to
right,
do codeless application development. We're going to do codeless test automation.
yeah.
And so now
That's a
you're
fun one.
asking a
Yeah.
developer potentially to go into some GUI where they're clicking and dragging things. And they're saying, well, it would be pretty easy to just add the code. Why don't I just add the code, right?
Yeah, and that's
Uh,
it's funny you mentioned the codeless stuff. That's a current predicament that we're running into right now with Salesforce because I mean we have, of course, we build our own applications internally, but we also rely on a whole bunch of different SaaS products out there, like a lot. Like we have so many
mhm.
integrations with all these different services, and one of those is Salesforce. And yeah, I was looking at Tricentis and Testim, which I think is part of Tricentis, and yeah, that's a whole other conversation we're having internally right now. So that's a fun one, the
Yeah,
whole
yeah,
codeless and how we can apply. I mean, the new one is like how, like, we have all these tests, which is fun and great, but now how can we apply AI to these tests? Like how can we realistically do this? And actually call it AI. That's
yeah,
another thing. Yeah,
yeah. And one thing I find that a lot of the tools are lacking these days when it comes to areas like that is, like if it's codeless, how do you maintain versions? Are you
yes,
checking it into a code repository? Because the number one thing in testing is, the version of the test has to line up with the version of the code you're testing, or you're going to
yep,
get test failures that don't mean anything, right? So you've got to figure out
absolutely.
the versioning part. And
Yeah,
I've
absolutely,
seen a lot of the
absolutely.
tools where it's easy for them to create a result, but it's hard to imagine creating an entire test suite where you've got you know 20 feature branches and you're running a different version of the test suite against each of the 20 different feature branches, right? So
Yeah,
I think
that's
some of those tools have they're in what I would consider more of the prototype phase and haven't addressed
yeah,
some of the problems of really scaling testing in an organization. So
yeah, no, definitely. And that's, we looked at it. I mean, lots of different tools in the past as well. Over the past, I don't want to say the past, but the past 2 years, over this more kind of recent push towards that space,
yeah,
codeless and
yes,
AI driven and everything else. But yeah,
yeah. So it sounds like you had a PyTest suite with Selenium that was running pretty well, and now you're migrating over to Playwright.
yeah,
Uh, how many tests do you have to go through, and kind of how far along are you in that journey?
So with PyTest, I'd say about probably like 700, maybe between
Mhm.
500 to 700. And, like a lot of those, that's probably a bit too many, but anyways, it's not it's not as much as other organizations that I've seen. We've
Mhm.
kept the, like, especially me, like I've kept the test suite really, really under a certain amount for per product. Like we have a lot of products, and like a very recent thing we've been doing as well, just for context, is we've been doing embedded testers like per product, and now they're contributing to test automation as well. So like that's a big thing that we did. Like we have a
Mhm.
test automation team, like the architecture, that's kind of focused on the architects behind all these products, but then also like embedded testers per product. So like they have the context behind what's actually being tested and everything else. So like now there's a number of tests being added. Some of which, like my structure that I've kind of brought upon the teams is uh, business critical tests are kind of like the focus point. So we're trying to do business critical testing, and we're trying to focus on that. So we keep the test size down. So that's kind of the goal of what we're trying to do. But as far as how many more we need to migrate over, we're not necessarily doing a full migration. We're at the process right now where we are, if a new product is being built with a new UI, that's when we'll apply Playwright. So the most recent example of that was like our homepage. We did a homepage redesign, and then that turned into like how people submit their vehicles to our site. So that turned into a different project. So like that's how we're redoing um, our testing. We're basically just doing it based, and it's a slow process because our team size isn't large. We're not taking on funding, so we're not scaling out the teams to these massive team sizes and everything else. So it's a slow process for certain,
Mhm.
but it's working for how we're doing it. It's working, and I will say the only risk behind that is some of these embedded testers are adding more tests to the Python Selenium PyTest suite, and it's good because we're getting that coverage that we need because we're still releasing product and features for some of our products that use kind of like legacy UIs and everything else. So like we're still releasing stuff because the people that we work with, our partners, and everything else, require some of these updates, and we can't just not release things. So yeah, it's certainly a dance that we're
Mhm.
doing. But for as far as moving over to Playwright entirely, thankfully we have team members that have the context of both tools. So that's a good thing. Even down to Python and TypeScript, which is good, myself included with that. But it's definitely a slow process, but it's working for how we're doing it. Because from a business decision, from a business standpoint, it's not like it's going to move the needle in terms of like revenue and everything else for us to move over everything to Playwright right now. So like that's kind of how we're like kind of justifying how we're doing things.
Mhm.
So
Yeah, it really seems like it's kind of a technical debt conversation, right? Just like we need to refactor our code as we go, we need to upgrade dependencies as we go. Sometimes we need to change what frameworks we're in. And as you mentioned, this is a move so that more of the team can participate in testing with less context switching and less learning curve. So, um, definitely seems like a good thing to do. One of the challenges I find when we work with teams that are doing migrations is if they don't have specific time set aside to do the migration, or they don't have resources applied to the migration in particular,
yeah,
uh, you do the math and then you find out, oh, this is going to take us another year, maybe two
yeah, no,
years.
it's a real
uh,
yeah, it's a real
if you're
issue. I mean,
looking
we're
at,
seeing that now. Yeah,
yeah, if you look at how many are converting, and so some of the teams I work with, they're also trying to make they go into sprint planning, and then the product
yeah,
owners are saying, okay, well, I want this feature, I want that feature, and you have a definition of done that says everything needs to be tested.
yeah,
It's if your team is sized appropriately, you spend most of your effort working on new functionality and keeping everything up and running your regression tests for releases. It's really hard to work in time to do these migrations. So it's good that you've been able to do that, and still make some
yeah.
progress on them. So,
No, definitely. Thank you. Yeah, and it's Yeah, it's an interesting time as well, just in general. Like, a lot of teams might see this because I've just, as raised in teams, small teams. I've always worked at startups. I've always been, we've always been scrappy to some degree. Every company I've ever worked at has been a startup, and I've, you know, grown with this current startup, which is good. So we've grown to a point where we're like, probably considered a medium sized organization at this point. But it's definitely interesting when you're coming from a bootstrap company because you understand, the financials. You understand down to the finances where you can't scale up the teams to accommodate maybe like what we mentioned, just like migrating to a new testing tool, and everything else. It's very difficult to because I've worked with the founders and the directors of the organization, SVPs and whatnot, and I've gained a sense of where the budgets go into play. So it's been interesting to see that and see that unfold. And how to appropriately address when we have to migrate to a new tool, but like how can we justify that to the business? Like even I was even selling, I sold test automation, automating what we were doing back in the day, to our, to the C-suite and everything else. Like, and my justification was, we want to release more frequently, and this is how we're going to do it, kind of thing. So yeah,
Mhm.
I've been in those situations quite a bit. More
So
recently was, yeah.
yeah, so what do you put in the business case for doing a framework migration?
So for us, the business case in this sense was, I think it was honestly primarily uh, pushing the test to all the team members so everybody can contribute. And really, the business justification there was just getting more coverage because our test team is only such a number, right? So we
Mhm.
were able to kind of have the developers also contribute to these. So and we're doing that with security as well, and infrastructure as well. We're with infrastructure with Terraform and everything else. We're going to have modules people can consume. So we're kind of taking our infrastructure team and turning them more into a platform team. So that's one thing we're doing. So we're kind of
Yeah.
making it more self-service, and same with security in some sense. Not everything in security, of course, but at least
Yeah.
at least the simple things like Dependabot and addressing their own CVEs and making sure it's not the Phoenix project is a good example, or the Unicorn project. There's a lot of these good books, Accelerate, and they all
Yeah.
talk about these things. We're breaking down the silos. So
Yeah, so it sounds like part of the business justification for the migration was rolled into, this idea of moving from quality assurance teams to quality enablement teams where,
yeah,
you have a more focused team that's focused on the tools, the infrastructure, the how do you do things, the specialized knowledge. They're working with all of the other development teams who are now contributing to the test. So this migration, at least in your case, was partially to help make the enablement team successful in spreading out to the rest of the organization. And so the trade off there would have been, well, if you wanted us to keep up with test automation, we would need a much larger QA team. And if it's a dedicated role, we need to balance the QA team with the development team. This is a way of having a
yeah,
smaller, more concentrated, more specialized team of experts that are then enabling the rest of the organization. And the
yeah,
migration was just
absolutely.
part of that, it sounds like.
Absolutely. Yeah, and that's exactly it. That was the kind of that was the main focus of the migration exactly. And it's in terms of like contribution and everything else, we want everything just to be a pull request away. Anyone can contribute to anything. But there's going to be ownership of that particular repository. For context, we use GitHub internally,
Mhm.
and we have a bunch of. We're not using monorepos or anything like that. We just have a bunch of different repositories, and like it's exactly what I wanted. I've always wanted, at least over the past couple of years, when I've learned more about these things. Starting in 2018, I've always wanted more teams to be able to contribute to anything that they want, regardless if it's test, regardless if it's infrastructure. We want infrastructure to be self-service, and we're pretty close to that. Actually, we're getting to a point right now where it's just about to the point where a team member can if they wanted to deploy their own infrastructure, like a test cluster or something, they could, it's a push button deploy kind of
Mhm.
scenario. But in same with security, like we want people to be able to do pull requests and address their CVEs that they need to, or we have other tools in place where somebody has a pull request, there's automatic scans in place, there's linting and everything else. So yeah, we
Mhm.
want everything to be a pull request. Like that's kind of the end game. Everyone
Cool.
can contribute to anything provided it's approved and everything else.
Yeah. So
So
out of the 700 or so end-to-end tests you have, what percentage of them are you running before pull requests versus after pull requests? Do you just run them nightly once everything's merged, or do you run them before the pull requests?
So right now, yeah. So in general, like one of the things that I wanted to do was run everything nightly. And the reasoning behind that is because I wanted. I think it was there was a talk I went to. God, 2014, 2015, maybe. In any case, it was like Selenium conference in Austin. There's a talk. The Build That Cried Wolf, I believe it was Andy Jones, and the cool mention is. That was brought up was something along the lines of like trusting, your developers have to trust your tests and everything else.
Mm-hmm.
So like I've always wanted to do that. That's why we run nightly. So we run everything nightly, and we have some tests that are in the delivery pipelines and everything else. And then we're moving towards the direction of having everything in the delivery pipeline specific to. And that's, the idea behind running nightly is just to prove out the test. So if something fails that night, we could address it. But the goal is, of course, like, developers, if something fails, it should, we really, really want it to fail for a reason. So that's why, and that's what we're doing right now. And we've run the test suite, as you can imagine, it's parallelized. It runs, it's still fairly long, like the whole running everything. And we just had a meeting today, actually, to break up each of these, because to break up our monolith, because we do have one monolith, I should say, like at least for the PyTest test suite. And we're going to break that up into its own repo per product. And then that's going to get us in the direction of having more of these tests that are running nightly in the delivery pipelines, which we're going to prove out, I think Q4 2024, we're actually going to finally do that. Because we've been doing this for a while. We've been doing things, we're running things nightly. Transparency, we are using Sauce Labs at the moment for how we're doing things. We talk about that for a while too. We tried it doing local. We were going to debate on getting our own infrastructure, and that's a whole running Selenium grid and everything else. But I'm glad we didn't do it that way, because a lot of us ended up, all of us ended up going remote. So that would have been problematic. But
well, we could have an entire another podcast episode on that topic. So that's near and dear to my heart.
Good times. That was a lot of fun. That was
So we're coming up on the end of the episode here. So really want to thank our guest today. Our guest today is Evan Niedojadlo, and he is an engineering manager at Peddle, and we've been talking today about making the transition from test engineering to being an SRE. We've also chatted some about infrastructure testing, and then wrapped it up with talking about when you can test things at different stages of your pipeline and migration. So a lot of really good topics today. So really appreciate your time, Evan, and thank you for being a guest on Developers Who Test.
Yeah, of course. Thank you for having me. And then, if anyone listens to this and hears something that can be improved upon or feedback or anything like that, feel free to reach out. You can find me across LinkedIn or my blog, YouTube. You can find me on YouTube at Random Thoughts Tech. So feel free to reach out. I'm always interested in having these conversations. I love to nerd out about all this stuff. So